When I was a kid growing up in Alaska, this was my family's first telephone, and my phone number was 3. That's right, I grew up somewhere so small that we had a single-digit phone number. Now there are some details of that. We didn't have an actual phone system other than one we built ourselves. We didn't even have much of a community other than one we built ourselves. It was a ghost town in rural southeast Alaska on Admiralty Island. There were no utilities, no city phone company, no power, and our phones were old World War II surplus Army field phones, probably stolen from a former military camp. This is not one of our original phones, but it's the same technology. It is a hand crank AC generated ringer, so to ring other phones in the system, you would crank this around, and the number of cranks basically indicates what number you're calling. So to call us, you have to hold this down because the ringer is difficult. To call our house, you would ring this 1, 2, 3. And our phones were a little better condition than this because we use them all the time, but this one has sat for 60 years. Now that ringer crank powered an AC generator inside here, which would send AC voltage down a pair of wires strung between the houses, and that would activate the ringer bell. Now, the actual phone was DC, so when you talked into the handset, that would generate a DC voltage on the microphone. These would usually have a bunch of D batteries in there to amplify that voltage, although you could still use them without the batteries. It was just very faint. And it did have a little push-to-talk button, just like a radio, so you would have to push that button to activate the amplifier, the D batteries, talk into the handset, just like a regular old phone, and the person on the other end could hear you. Now, it was a party line, meaning that every phone on the system, every phone hooked up to those 2 wires could hear each other, so you could listen in on the neighbors' calls if you really wanted to. Generally, it was good courtesy not to eavesdrop. If you heard 2 rings, it was our neighbors to the right, and 4 rings was our neighbors to the left, so yeah, it was just a very small network, essentially. When my family sold our home in Alaska and scattered across the lower 48, we left most of the equipment like this behind, and we found some of it last time I was there visiting the old house, but these are some that I've found here in the Midwest at estate sales and surplus auctions and whatnot, and I want to do another video on the actual phones because I have a few of these that I've collected, but that might have to be another video. In this one, I just kind of wanted to talk about how did we use some of these technologies and what else did we have for communication. So this was my family's first telephone, and this was our third one, and the second one was essentially the same, but this is a Motorola mobile radio, UHF, around 450 megahertz, something around there. I forget what our exact frequency was, but this was a radio telephone, and again, this was part of a larger DIY system that we had to kind of assemble out of spare parts. I believe we got a bunch of these Motorola radios as surplus from some oil company. Our second phone system was also a radio telephone system, and that was a commercial company that set up radio phones, and it was also a party line. And how that worked was they gave out a bunch of these radios to customers, and they would actually have a dial pad, a numeric keypad on the mic. This mic doesn't have that, but there would be a repeater station or central receiver in Juneau hooked up to the telephone system, to the landline phones. If you're a ham radio operator, if you've heard of a phone patch, very similar to that, but this was a private system. And again, we shared that with a couple other communities. We shared that with, I think some of our neighbors had the same phone. There was a logging camp near us that had the same phone. And so you could only really use it when nobody else was using it. And you could definitely hear at least part of the conversation from other people. I believe that second system used a different transmit and receive frequency, similar to the third system here. So you could really only hear half of the conversation. Again, similar to the old marine operator system, which I'm getting very sidetracked here, but there was yet another system that the Coast Guard, I believe, operated, or maybe it was the phone company, where you could call in on a marine VHF radio, have that patched into the phone system, and that was kind of kludgy and very expensive, so we didn't use that a lot. Now that second radio telephone party line system was only around for a couple years. I vaguely remember it. I don't think it was very successful, and I think the company went out of business. So then, since we did not have a phone line to town anymore, we had to set up our own system, and there was a company in town that was able to basically get that all set up for us, program the radios, help us get the technology figured out. This was when I was a very young child, so I didn't know anything about radio stuff. It was all my parents setting up these things, again with help from a communications company in Juneau. I found a numeric keypad to give you an example here, although I don't think this one's compatible with this radio. But when you wanted to make a call, you basically had to first key up the repeater, key up the phone patch in town, let it know that a call was coming in. So you would send it a code like *7. That would activate the phone patch in Juneau. On our end, we would hear a dial tone, and then you knew you could dial with the buttons, and you couldn't dial too fast. You had to kind of go slow, and sometimes you'd have to redial if it didn't come through all the way. If you needed to hang up or restart, you would hit #7, and that would tell the phone patch in Juneau, okay, hang up the line. And we had what was called semi-duplex. So we could talk over someone. We had one radio at the house with 2 frequencies, a different send and receive frequency. The phone patch in town had 2 radios, a receive radio and a transmit radio, again on different frequencies. We could basically only talk or listen. We had to wait, just like a ham radio, a CB radio, to take turns between the caller and the listener. But if we got somebody who was really long-winded, if we had a telemarketer who would just not shut up, we could prioritize on the house end. We could talk over them. And I think that was a later addition. I don't think we had that initially. I think the original party line system that we had, I think it was like Tongass Communications, that was just a single, a simplex radio. And I think our original radio telephone on the 3rd system was also simplex, but we pretty quickly upgraded that to semi-duplex. So we had at least some control from our end, and we could actually hang up. So if something happened, if something went wrong, if the call dropped and we were just getting static on our end, we could still override and prioritize that hang up with the #7 command. Now that didn't always work 100%. Sometimes things would get stuck and we would just have no phone. We would just be hearing static on the phone because something was wrong in town, and we would then have to get a hold of somebody in town in some other method, either let somebody know who was out there who was going back into town, maybe let the pilot know on the weekly mail plane, hey, something's wrong with our phone, and then somebody would have to go out to where that phone patch was and manually reset it. So yeah, it was not always 100% accurate and it had some issues, but it was better than nothing, and it was definitely not nothing. It let us communicate with town, it let us figure out when the mail plane was coming, let the mail plane company know what the weather was like, give information to other people in town, talk to family and friends, just all the things that you could do with a regular phone. I believe my parents had a deal with a local company in town who had sort of line of sight to us, although there was an island in the way. We lived on the other side of Admiralty Island from that phone patch station out to us, and we had directional UHF antennas pointing in each direction, but it did still have to go through some trees. It had to go over an island, and it worked fairly well. The antenna at our end out at the house was way up in a 100-foot tall spruce tree, and the antenna looked something like this. This one is a 430 to 450 megahertz UHF antenna, so very similar to what we would have. There were a couple other antenna designs that we played around with. So yeah, that was what I remember from childhood of being able to make phone calls locally between the few neighbor houses we had. You would crank up the field phone, and we had a phone out in the workshop too, so you could even call from the house out to the shop. And then if we wanted to call out into the wider world, fire up the radio telephone, dial that up, and hope that it stayed working. If you called for too long, one or more of the radio units would sometimes overheat and just shut down. So things like homeschool teleconferences. We were homeschooled. My mom taught my sister and I at the kitchen table. There was a state-run non-religious homeschool system in Alaska, and so a lot of her communication with the correspondence teachers was through the radio phone, and if there were long parent-teacher conferences, the phones would overheat. So similar when we were dealing with government stuff, my folks were always talking about local government things in Juneau, trying to get things like the mail service funded, things like the weather service, things like public dock repair, just anything related to the relatively few government services that we had available. And you couldn't take any of those government services for granted because the government was always looking for ways to cut the budget. In fact, I think now there's no more airmail service to a lot of these small towns in Alaska. There's almost no dock maintenance. The last time we were out there, the public dock was just crumbling into the ocean. So the government has cut a lot of that stuff. They have cut off funding for a lot of these small Alaska towns. And it's getting harder and harder to live out in the middle of nowhere the way we did. Even though there are better communication options now, like Starlink, like cell phones, the actual support, the actual infrastructure to make a life off-grid on an island in Alaska is getting more and more difficult. Now, speaking of cell phones, somebody will probably ask, why didn't we use a cell phone? Well, those didn't work very well. The early systems in the 90s were all analog, and there were only very few towers, and they didn't really cover our area at all. Sometime in the 2000s, the 2G and maybe 3G started to come along, and Alaska was always about 10 years behind on cell phone technology. So even when 3G was starting to be rolled out in rural Alaska, the towers were actually still using analog 1G. So I knew some people who had the old analog scanners. I never did, but I knew people who would listen in on phone calls because you could still do that with the analog cell phones. We did try a couple different cell phones, and the only thing that really worked was to have a cell phone handset that had an external antenna jack connected to an amplifier, connected to another antenna way up high on a pole that would hit the one cell phone tower that was about 20 miles in the other direction from Juneau. We couldn't hit the Juneau cell phone network at all. So that was a very kludgy system, didn't really work very well, didn't work all the time. So really, even after we got cell phones, we still relied very heavily on the old radio telephone system because this was kind of tried and true. This would work through a lot more inclement weather than the cell phones would work. This would work if the cell phone tower went down. And yeah, it was just a lot more reliable system because we had used it for so long. We did eventually get satellite internet, which I've talked about in other videos. We had Star Band, which was completely different from Starlink. That didn't show up until relatively recently. Star Band used a kind of bigger DirecTV style dish and a transmitter. Yeah, that would give us kind of very laggy internet. We had about, I think, 500K downlink and 56K uplink. And for television, we did have a big old C-band dish when I was a kid, and we could get about 2 channels. We could get RatNet, which was the Rural Alaska Television Network, basically PBS with a couple network shows mixed in like Star Trek. And if we went out and wiggled the satellite dish around and screwed around with the receiver, I think we could get MTV2 and maybe a Russian channel, but that was about it until maybe, again, around 2000 or so when we got, I think, a Dish Network or DirecTV set up, and then we could get kind of more regular satellite television. But I'm getting off topic again. The main thing I wanted to share in this video was just what phone systems did I remember from childhood and what did we use to keep in touch with people around our community and out in the general wide world. And I should mention we also used CB radios to talk to neighbors who were a little farther away than the old field phone network ran. Boats would use VHF marine radios, which I've showed in some other videos. You weren't technically supposed to operate those from shore, although the Coast Guard actually appreciated that a lot of rural island residents had VHF radios in their houses because then they could hear distress calls and they could often respond much quicker than the Coast Guard could in case of an emergency. So now, there were definitely people who did ham radio or had amateur radio licenses, and in fact, I got an amateur radio license when I went to college. I've had that for about 25 years now, and I've only ever had the technician license, and I don't actually use it too much. People have asked, well, why don't you get on the air? Why don't you do ham radio stuff? Partly that's because I'm always busy doing other things, and I think when I was a kid, even when I got the radio license back in college, yeah, we were already doing so much radio stuff just as a tool, as an everyday piece of communication technology that I didn't have as much time to use it as a toy, as a hobby, as amateur radio. And that's being unfair to amateur radio. It's more than just a toy, it's more than just a hobby, but it is something that I have not always had time for because I'm always busy doing other things with radios, and that kind of satisfies my urge for radio communication, and satellite communication these days is mostly what I spend my time on. I did own some single sideband and HF ham radio stuff when I was a kid, and I just never got around to setting it up. Somebody had given me this stuff and it kind of sat around on my to-do pile all through kind of high school and college, and I ended up giving it away when we moved. And kind of the same thing today. I have some HF radio gear, I have some ham radio stuff, and it sits on the to-do pile, and it's always, well, maybe I'll get around to it eventually. I don't really have much of a ham shack. I have my garage here, which is not really conducive for radio equipment because it's filled with sawdust and smoke and adhesives and all kinds of other things that you don't really want to get airborne and get into your electronics. And my house is just so full of junk that I don't really have anywhere to set up radios. So these days when I do any ham radio stuff, it's usually on an HT, a handheld transceiver. I have sometimes mounted these old Motorola's in my car and programmed them for ham frequencies for 70 centimeter on the UHF ones and 2 meter on the VHF models. And I've actually gone through a few of these. I've killed one or two. One got stolen once when my car got stolen. I still have one or two, but some of these they're getting a little old. They're getting a little flaky. And they're not very flexible. Even with the handheld keypad, it's really a pain to program Motorola radios. Cheap modern radios like Baofeng, you can just program them with any computer and a simple USB cable. And I know real ham radio operators hate Baofeng, but I love the things because they're so easy to get up and running. Whereas these things, yeah, they're just a pain. Now every now and then we heard pirates. Every now and then we get radio pirates on our frequency, on our phone, and we'd hear somebody just yapping away talking about fishing or hunting, and I don't know what they were doing, if they were using a hacked ham radio, if they were using a business radio, if they had something similar to us where they just got a hold of a bunch of old surplus radios from an oil company and just popped in whatever frequency and happened to sit on top of ours. It didn't happen very often, and it was kind of hard to talk back to them because if we could hear them on the receive frequency, we were transmitting on a different frequency, so they weren't necessarily hearing what we were trying to say back to them. But yeah, that was just an odd little quirk of the radio telephone world, is every now and then you'd be trying to make a phone call and you'd hear some random hunter on your call instead. Anyway, I think that's about all I have for Alaska radio telephone anecdotes at the moment. I think I will wrap this video up. If you want to see more about some of these old radios, let me know and I can try to do a follow-up video. I definitely want to do a follow-up with the hand crank army phones, since I have a bunch of those. I had some of these set up out at Sandland. We had phone wires strung between the monorail and the tunnels and the treehouse. And yeah, some trees fell on the wires, the squirrels ate the wires, so that system doesn't really work right now. But I would like to do more with those field phones, so that will be a future video at some point. I hope this has been at least somewhat interesting, even if it's just me standing here talking, waving around obsolete electronics. If you did sit through the whole video, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.